The ocean is one of nature's most powerful forces comprehension. Throughout history, massive walls of water have swept, capable of unleashing destruction that defies human across coastlines, erasing entire communities in minutes, and leaving behind stories that seem too incredible to be true. These are the deadly tsunami stories you won't believe. December 26th, 2004. The Indian Ocean appears calm as tourists enjoy their morning routines along pristine beaches from Thailand to Sri Lanka. But beneath the surface, something catastrophic has just occurred. A massive earthquake measuring 9.1 on the Richter scale has ruptured the ocean floor off the coast of Sumatra, displacing billions of tons of water and setting into motion one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. What happened next would challenge everything we thought we knew about the ocean's power. Witnesses described seeing the water recede dramatically, exposing coral reefs and stranded fish that had never been visible before. Many curious beachgoers walked out onto the newly exposed seabed, collecting shells and marvelling at this strange phenomenon. They had no idea they were witnessing the ocean's warning sign. Within minutes, a wall of water 30 feet high came roaring back toward shore at the speed of a commercial jet. The stories that emerged from that day are almost impossible to comprehend. In Khao Lak, Thailand, a British tourist named Richard was having breakfast with his family when he noticed something peculiar happening to the ocean. The water was pulling back further than he had ever seen, revealing rocks and coral formations that normally lay hidden beneath the waves. His first instinct was to grab his camera and start recording what he thought was a rare natural phenomenon. Within moments, Richard realized this was no ordinary event. The horizon began to change, and what looked like a distant white line started growing larger and larger. The white line was the crest of a massive tsunami wave, and it was moving toward shore at incredible speed. Richard and his family had less than 10 minutes to evacuate their beachfront hotel before the wave struck with devastating force. But Richard's story takes an even more remarkable turn. As the family fled inland, they encountered a local Thai man who was frantically trying to warn tourists in broken English about the approaching danger. This man had lived his entire life near the ocean and recognized the signs that foreign visitors could not understand. His desperate attempts to communicate the urgency of the situation saved dozens of lives that morning, including Richard's family. The wave that struck Khao Lak was unlike anything witnesses had ever imagined. It wasn't the curved, breaking wave that surfers ride or that we see in movies. Instead, it was a massive surge of dark water filled with debris, cars, trees and buildings that had been picked up along its path. The sound was described as deafening, like a freight train mixed with the roar of 1,000 waterfalls. What makes this story even more incredible is what happened after the initial wave struck. The tsunami didn't just hit once and recede. Wave after wave continued to pound the coastline for hours, each one carrying more destruction inland. Buildings that had somehow survived the first impact were demolished by subsequent waves. The ocean had become a relentless force of destruction that refused to stop. In another part of Thailand, a remarkable survival story unfolded that defies all logic. A young German tourist named Petra was snorkeling in shallow water when she noticed the ocean floor suddenly dropping away beneath her. The water around her began moving with unusual force, carrying her out to sea faster than she could swim back to shore. Within minutes, she found herself being swept along by the tsunami wave itself. Most people caught in such circumstances would not survive, but Petra's story is extraordinary because of what happened next. Instead of being crushed by debris or dragged underwater, she managed to grab onto a large piece of floating timber that had been torn from a nearby resort. For the next 6 hours, she rode this makeshift raft as the tsunami carried her miles from shore. During her ordeal, Petra witnessed scenes of destruction that seemed like something from an apocalyptic movie. She watched entire buildings being swept out to sea, saw cars floating like toys, and observed the complete transformation of the coastline she had been enjoying just hours earlier. The most haunting part of her account is the silence that followed the initial chaos. After the roaring stopped, she found herself floating in an ocean filled with debris, completely alone. Petra's rescue came in the most unlikely way. A Thai fishing boat that had somehow survived the disaster spotted her floating in the open ocean. The fishermen later said they almost didn't investigate what they thought was just another piece of debris, but something compelled them to take a closer look. When they realized it was a person, they couldn't believe anyone could have survived being carried so far out to sea. The stories from Sri Lanka reveal another dimension of the tsunami's incredible power. In the coastal town of Gal, an ancient Portuguese fort that had stood for over 400 years became an unlikely refuge for thousands of people. The massive stone walls, built to withstand cannon fire from enemy ships, proved to be one of the few structures capable of stopping the tsunami's advance. Witness accounts from inside the fort describe a scene that sounds like something from a disaster movie. As the tsunami approached, thousands of people climbed onto the fort's walls, watching in terror as the wave consumed everything around them. The water rose so high that it nearly reached the top of the 40-foot walls, but the ancient structure held firm. Those inside the fort watched helplessly as their neighborhoods, businesses and homes disappeared beneath the churning water. What makes the Gala Fort story even more remarkable is the discovery made after the water receded. Hidden beneath centuries of sediment and debris, the tsunami had uncovered archaeological treasures that had been lost for generations. Ancient coins, pottery, and even parts of sunken ships were revealed when the massive waves stripped away layers of sand and silt from the ocean floor and coastline. The power of the tsunami wasn't just in its size, but in its ability to completely transform the landscape. In some areas, the wave travelled more than 2 miles inland, carrying boats, cars, and entire buildings far from their original locations. Satellite images taken before and after the disaster show coastal areas that are completely unrecognizable, as if the Earth itself had been rearranged by an invisible hand. One of the most haunting aspects of these tsunami stories is how quickly everything changed. People who were enjoying peaceful beach vacations one moment found themselves fighting for their lives the next. The randomness of survival often defied explanation. Some people were swept miles out to sea and lived to tell about it, while others who seemed to be in safer locations were lost forever. The stories also reveal the incredible power of human intuition and animal instincts in the face of natural disaster. Many survivors reported that animals began acting strangely hours before the tsunami struck. Dogs refused to go on their usual beach walks, elephants trumpeted in distress and headed for higher ground, and birds abandoned their coastal nesting areas en masse. These animal behaviours weren't just coincidental. Scientists now understand that many animals can detect the subtle changes in atmospheric pressure, ground vibrations, and electromagnetic fields that precede major seismic events. The animals were responding to signals that humans couldn't perceive, trying to warn of the approaching danger in the only way they could. The human stories of intuition are equally compelling. Several survivors reported feeling an overwhelming urge to leave the beach area even before they saw any obvious signs of danger. Some described it as a gut feeling that something was wrong, while others mentioned experiencing an unusual sense of unease that they couldn't explain. These instinctive responses saved lives in cases where logical thinking might have led to fatal delays. As we delve deeper into these incredible tsunami stories, it becomes clear that the ocean's power extends far beyond what most people can imagine. The waves that struck on that December morning didn't just move water, they moved mountains of debris, reshaped entire coastlines, and forever changed the lives of millions of people around the Indian Ocean. The destruction wasn't limited to what people could see on the surface. Beneath the waves, the tsunami had created an underwater graveyard that would haunt divers and marine biologists for years to come. When rescue teams finally began underwater recovery operations weeks later, they discovered scenes that challenged their understanding of the ocean's power. Entire coral reefs had been stripped bare and relocated miles from their original positions. Massive boulders weighing several tons had been moved like pebbles across the ocean floor. Most shocking of all were the perfectly preserved structures that had been buried under sand for decades, suddenly exposed by the tsunami's incredible force. In one particularly chilling discovery off the coast of Phuket, divers found a complete village that had been swept into the ocean intact. Houses, roads, and even vehicles remained in their relative positions, creating an eerie underwater ghost town 30 feet beneath the surface. The preservation was so complete that investigators could identify individual rooms and personal belongings scattered throughout the submerged community. But perhaps the most extraordinary survival story from that day comes from a small fishing village in Tamil Nadu, India. A 10-year-old girl named Tilly was playing on the beach with her younger brother when she noticed something that would save hundreds of lives. Having recently studied tsunamis in her geography class, she recognized the warning signs that adults around her were missing completely. As the ocean began its dramatic retreat, exposing vast stretches of seabed, Tilly frantically began warning everyone around her about what was coming. Her parents initially dismissed her concerns, thinking she was simply being dramatic. But Tilly's persistence and genuine terror convinced her family to start moving inland immediately. What happened next demonstrates the incredible power of education and quick thinking. Tilly didn't just save her own family, she continued shouting warnings to other tourists and locals as they moved to higher ground. Her desperate pleas convinced dozens of people to abandon the beach area just minutes before the massive waves struck. The beach where Tilly had been playing was completely devastated by the tsunami. Every building within half a mile of the shoreline was destroyed, and the wave penetrated nearly 2 miles inland. But the area where Tilly had convinced people to gather remained safe, elevated just enough above sea level to avoid the worst of the destruction. Tilly's story spread around the world, highlighting how disaster preparedness education can save lives in the most unexpected circumstances. But her account also reveals something else about that terrible day. The tsunami struck with such force that it actually changed the rotation of the Earth itself. Scientists later calculated that the massive displacement of water and debris caused by the earthquake and tsunami shortened the length of Earth's day by 2.68 microseconds. The planet's axis shifted by nearly an inch, a change so significant that it affected satellite navigation systems for months afterward. The tsunami hadn't just devastated coastlines, it had literally moved the planet. The wave's journey across the Indian Ocean created a cascade of incredible stories in every location it touched. In the Maldives, where the highest point above sea level is barely 8 feet, entire islands disappeared completely underwater. Resort guests found themselves clinging to palm trees as their luxury accommodations were swept away beneath them. One particularly harrowing account comes from a British couple celebrating their honeymoon at an exclusive resort. When the tsunami struck, they were separated by the rushing water and spent nearly 12 hours believing the other had died. The husband was carried nearly 3 miles inland, while his wife was swept out to sea before managing to grab onto floating debris. Their reunion came about through an almost impossible coincidence. Both had been rescued by different teams and taken to separate temporary shelters. It was only when the wife mentioned her husband's distinctive tattoo to a relief worker that the connection was made. The relief worker had heard another survivor describing the exact same tattoo while searching for his missing wife. The psychological impact of these survival stories often proved as devastating as the physical destruction. Many survivors reported experiencing a complete shift in their perception of the ocean's power. People who had lived their entire lives near the water suddenly found themselves unable to approach the beach without overwhelming anxiety. This phenomenon became particularly evident in the fishing communities that depended on the ocean for their survival. Fishermen who had spent decades reading the sea's moods and understanding its patterns suddenly felt betrayed by waters they had trusted their entire lives. Some never returned to their boats, unable to reconcile their intimate knowledge of the ocean with its capacity for such sudden, devastating violence. The children who survived faced their own unique challenges. Many had witnessed destruction that their young minds struggled to process. Child psychologists working in the affected areas reported that survivors often drew pictures of waves that filled entire pages, with tiny stick figures running away from walls of blue water that seemed to touch the sky. These drawings revealed something profound about how the tsunami had affected not just the physical landscape, but the mental landscape of an entire generation. Children who had grown up playing in tide pools and building sandcastles now saw the ocean as a monster capable of consuming everything they loved. Yet among all these stories of destruction and trauma, accounts of incredible human compassion began to emerge. In Thailand, Buddhist monks opened their temples to provide shelter for anyone who needed it, regardless of nationality or religion. Local families who had lost everything still shared their remaining food with stranded tourists. The international response also created its own remarkable stories. Rescue teams from around the world worked together in ways that transcended political boundaries and cultural differences. Swedish search teams worked alongside Thai military units, Japanese medical personnel treated patients alongside local doctors, and American helicopter pilots flew missions coordinated by Indian naval officers. One rescue operation that captured global attention involved a massive international effort to locate and evacuate tourists from remote islands that had been completely cut off from communication. Satellite phones became lifelines connecting desperate families with loved ones who were missing in paradise locations that had become disaster zones overnight. The technology available in 2004 meant that many people witnessed the tsunami's approach through digital cameras and early mobile phone videos. These recordings provided unprecedented documentation of the wave's power, but they also created ethical dilemmas about sharing footage of people's final moments. Some of the most compelling video evidence came from security cameras in hotels and businesses along the affected coastlines. These cameras captured the tsunami's approach from multiple angles, showing how the wave's speed and size varied depending on the underwater topography and coastal features. The footage revealed that the tsunami wasn't uniform in its destruction. In some areas, the wave appeared as a rapidly rising tide that gradually engulfed buildings. In others, it struck as a towering wall of water that obliterated everything in its path within seconds. These variations in the wave's behavior created pockets of survival in unexpected locations, while devastating areas that seemed better protected. Analysis of this footage also helped scientists understand why some warning systems failed so catastrophically. The tsunami moved faster than most communication networks could spread alerts, and many coastal areas lacked the infrastructure necessary to receive and act on emergency warnings, even if they had been issued in time. The stories from that day continue to influence how we prepare for and respond to natural disasters. The lessons learned from individual acts of heroism, quick thinking, and community cooperation have shaped modern emergency response protocols around the world. But perhaps most importantly, these incredible survival stories serve as reminders of both human vulnerability and resilience in the face of nature's most awesome power. The technological revolution that followed the Indian Ocean tsunami created new ways to document and understand these extraordinary events. Social media platforms, which were just emerging in 2004, became vital tools for connecting survivors with their families and sharing real-time information about rescue efforts. But they also preserved thousands of personal accounts that reveal the psychological complexity of surviving such overwhelming natural forces. Among these digital testimonies, one story stands out for its bizarre and haunting details. A Swedish photographer named Eric was documenting marine life in shallow waters near Phi Island when the ocean began its ominous retreat. Instead of fleeing immediately, his professional instincts compelled him to continue photographing what he recognized as an unprecedented natural phenomenon. Eric's underwater camera captured images that marine biologists still study today. As the water receded, he documented fish desperately swimming in circles in rapidly shrinking pools, coral formations suddenly exposed to air for the first time in centuries, and most remarkably, the complete emptying of an underwater cave system that had never been accessible to human exploration. The photographs show artifacts and formations that had been hidden beneath the waves for generations. Ancient pottery shards, pieces of shipwrecks from different historical periods, and geological formations that told the story of previous tsunamis that had struck the same coastline hundreds of years earlier. Eric had inadvertently created an archaeological record of the ocean floor's hidden history. But Eric's story takes a terrifying turn when his photographs captured the approaching tsunami from below the surface. Having moved to slightly deeper water to continue his documentation, he found himself in the unique position of witnessing the wave's underwater structure. His images show a wall of churning water and debris approaching like an underwater avalanche, carrying everything from uprooted trees to pieces of buildings in its chaotic embrace. The final photographs in Eric's camera were recovered 3 weeks later, when his waterproof housing washed ashore nearly 200 miles from where he had been shooting. The last images show the photographer's desperate attempt to swim upward as the tsunami engulfed him from below. Miraculously, Eric survived by riding the wave's upward surge, but his account of being tumbled through the underwater chaos reads like something from a science fiction novel. According to Eric's testimony, being inside the tsunami wave felt like being trapped in a washing machine filled with debris from an entire civilization. Cars, furniture, trees, and building materials swirled around him in a deadly vortex that defied every natural law he thought he understood. The water itself had become solid with debris, creating a semi-liquid environment where normal swimming was impossible. His survival came through a combination of luck and the strange physics of tsunami waves. The massive amount of debris actually created pockets of air that allowed him to breathe intermittently as he was carried along. When the wave finally deposited him on what had once been a hillside forest, he found himself buried under a mixture of sand, seaweed, and fragments of someone's destroyed home. The aftermath stories from various locations reveal how the tsunami's impact extended far beyond the immediate destruction. In Sri Lanka, the wave's retreat exposed ancient Buddhist statues that had been submerged for over 1,000 years. Local archaeologists working with international teams discovered that previous tsunamis had repeatedly buried and revealed these same monuments throughout history. Carbon dating of organic material found in the newly exposed areas revealed evidence of at least 6 major tsunami events over the past 2 millennia. Each wave had left its own signature in the geological record, creating a timeline of destruction and recovery that painted a sobering picture of the ocean's cyclical power. The 2004 tsunami wasn't an anomaly, but part of a pattern that had been repeating for centuries. In the Andaman Islands, indigenous communities that had lived in isolation for thousands of years demonstrated survival knowledge that astonished modern researchers. The Onge people, who had minimal contact with the outside world, successfully evacuated to higher ground hours before the tsunami struck their islands. Their oral traditions contained detailed descriptions of the ocean's warning signs that proved more accurate than modern seismological equipment. Anthropologists studying these communities discovered that tsunami survival knowledge had been passed down through generations via songs, stories, and rituals that encoded practical information about recognizing and responding to seismic sea waves. The indigenous peoples had developed sophisticated understanding of how different types of ground shaking corresponded to different levels of tsunami threat. One elderly Ong leader explained through translators that their ancestors had taught them to read the ocean's breathing patterns. When the sea inhaled too deeply, pulling water far from shore, it meant the ocean was preparing to exhale with devastating force. This metaphorical language had preserved life-saving knowledge for countless generations without the need for written records or modern technology. The wave's impact on marine ecosystems created its own category of incredible stories. Marine biologists conducting post-tsunami surveys discovered that entire underwater landscapes had been rearranged. Coral reefs that had taken centuries to develop were found miles from their original locations, somehow transplanted intact to completely different underwater environments. Even more remarkable were the discoveries of deep-sea creatures that had been carried into shallow coastal waters by the tsunami's immense power. Species typically found at depths of several thousand feet were discovered in tide pools and shallow lagoons, providing marine scientists with unprecedented opportunities to study organisms that are normally impossible to observe in their natural habitat. One particularly fascinating discovery involved a species of bioluminescent jellyfish that had never been documented in coastal waters. These creatures, normally inhabitants of the deep ocean trenches, had been swept up by the tsunami and deposited in shallow areas where their natural light displays created an eerie blue glow in the post-disaster darkness. The ecological disruption extended to land animals as well. Elephants, dogs, and various bird species had demonstrated remarkable predictive abilities in the hours before the tsunami struck. Researchers studying animal behavior patterns discovered that domestic animals had become increasingly agitated up to 24 hours before the seismic event, suggesting they could detect precursor signals that human technology had missed entirely. In Thailand, elephant handlers reported that their animals had broken free from their restraints and fled to higher ground, carrying tourists on their backs, despite having no training for emergency evacuation procedures. The elephants seemed to understand the urgency of the situation better than the humans around them, demonstrating an instinctive knowledge of natural disaster response that saved numerous lives. These animal stories prompted scientists to develop new early warning systems based on monitoring wildlife behavior patterns. Research stations began tracking the movements and stress indicators of various species as potential predictors of seismic activity. The traditional practice of observing animal behavior for natural disaster prediction, dismissed by modern science for decades, suddenly gained renewed credibility. The long-term environmental changes caused by the tsunami created ongoing survival challenges for coastal communities. Saltwater intrusion had contaminated freshwater supplies miles inland, making previously fertile agricultural areas unsuitable for farming. The wave had deposited millions of tons of sand and debris in inappropriate locations, fundamentally altering drainage patterns and flood zones. Recovery efforts revealed the incredible resilience of both human communities and natural ecosystems. Within months, mangrove forests began regenerating in areas where they had been completely destroyed. These coastal forests, which serve as natural barriers against storm surges, demonstrated their own form of disaster preparedness by maintaining extensive root systems that could sprout new growth even after total above-ground destruction. Local fishing communities developed innovative techniques for navigating the dramatically changed underwater topography. Traditional landmarks had been destroyed or relocated, forcing fishermen to create entirely new mental maps of their ancestral fishing grounds. Some areas that had been shallow enough for small boats were now deep water zones, while former deep water areas had been filled with debris and sediment. The cultural impact of these changes created its own compelling narratives. Entire coastal villages had to relocate inland, abandoning ancestral lands that had been home to the same families for generations. Traditional ceremonies and cultural practices tied to specific coastal locations had to be adapted or abandoned entirely when those sacred sites disappeared beneath the waves or were buried under tons of debris. Religious and spiritual responses to the tsunami varied dramatically across different cultures and communities. Some survivors interpreted the disaster as divine punishment, while others saw it as a test of faith or a call to spiritual renewal. Buddhist monks in affected areas reported increased interest in meditation practices focused on impermanence and the illusory nature of material attachments. Hindu communities developed new ritual practices for honoring the dead who were lost to the ocean and whose bodies were never recovered. Traditional funeral ceremonies had to be modified to address the unique circumstances of mass casualties, where individual identification was often impossible. These adapted rituals became important tools for community healing and psychological recovery. The medical challenges faced by survivor communities created their own extraordinary stories. Field hospitals established in the disaster zones dealt with injuries and medical conditions that most healthcare workers had never encountered. The combination of saltwater exposure, debris impacts, and psychological trauma created complex medical situations that required innovative treatment approaches. Volunteer medical teams from around the world found themselves working in conditions that resembled battlefield medicine more than traditional disaster response. The lack of basic infrastructure meant that life-saving surgeries were performed in makeshift operating rooms using improvised equipment and sterilization techniques. Many medical professionals described the experience as simultaneously the most challenging and most meaningful work of their careers. The stories of individual medical heroism during the crisis demonstrate the extraordinary lengths people went to save lives under impossible circumstances. Local doctors worked for days without sleep, treating patients while dealing with their own family losses and destroyed homes. International medical volunteers flew into disaster zones with minimal equipment, relying on creativity and determination to provide care in environments that lacked basic necessities like clean water and electricity. These medical response stories also revealed the importance of cultural sensitivity in disaster relief efforts. International medical teams had to quickly learn local customs and practices to provide effective care, while respecting traditional beliefs about health, death, and healing. The most successful relief efforts were those that integrated modern medical techniques with traditional healing practices and cultural protocols. As rescue operations transitioned into long-term recovery efforts, new categories of remarkable stories emerged. The process of rebuilding entire communities from scratch created opportunities for innovation and improvement that might never have existed without the complete destruction of existing infrastructure. Some coastal areas were rebuilt using tsunami-resistant architectural designs that incorporated traditional building techniques with modern engineering principles. Educational initiatives that emerged from the disaster created their own inspiring narratives. Schools throughout the affected regions developed comprehensive tsunami preparedness programs that taught children to recognize natural warning signs and respond appropriately to emergency situations. These programs often involved entire communities, turning disaster preparedness into a shared cultural practice rather than just an individual responsibility. The psychological recovery process revealed the complex ways that communities process collective trauma. Support groups formed organically among survivors who shared similar experiences, creating networks of mutual aid that extended far beyond the immediate disaster response period. These survivor communities developed their own terminology and communication methods for discussing experiences that were difficult for outsiders to understand. Children who survived the tsunami often became advocates for disaster preparedness in their communities, sharing their experiences through art, writing, and public speaking. Their perspectives on the disaster differed significantly from adult accounts, often focusing on sensory details and emotional responses that provided unique insights into the human experience of surviving natural disasters. The international scientific community's response to the tsunami created collaborative research initiatives that continue to influence our understanding of seismic sea waves. The disaster provided researchers with unprecedented amounts of data about tsunami behavior, wave propagation patterns, and the interaction between seismic events and ocean dynamics. This research has led to significant improvements in warning systems and coastal protection strategies worldwide. The stories from this remarkable day continue to shape how we understand the relationship between human civilization and natural forces. They remind us that despite all our technological advances and scientific knowledge, we remain vulnerable to powers that operate on scales beyond our immediate comprehension. Yet these same stories also demonstrate the incredible capacity for human adaptation, cooperation, and resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The technological advances that emerged from studying the 2004 tsunami fundamentally changed how we monitor ocean activity around the globe. Deep ocean sensors were deployed across major fault lines, creating an early warning network that could detect seismic activity and calculate tsunami arrival times for coastal communities thousands of miles away. But even these sophisticated systems couldn't have predicted what happened next in the world of deadly tsunami encounters. Japan, March 11, 2011. The most seismically prepared nation on Earth was about to face a tsunami that would challenge every assumption about modern disaster preparedness. At 2:46 in the afternoon, a magnitude 9 earthquake struck off the northeastern coast, generating a tsunami that would rewrite the textbooks on wave science and human survival. What made this tsunami different from previous disasters wasn't just its size, but the fact that it was captured in unprecedented detail by thousands of cameras, smartphones, and security systems throughout the affected region. The resulting footage created a real-time documentary of destruction that allowed scientists and the public to witness the precise mechanics of how these massive waves consume modern infrastructure. The most haunting video came from the town of Minami-Sanriku, where a 3-story emergency broadcast building became the final refuge for dozens of people who had followed official evacuation procedures. The footage shows people crowding onto the building's roof as the black water rises around them, consuming the town's carefully planned tsunami barriers and designated safe zones. What happened next defied every computer model and engineering calculation that had been used to design the town's defences. The wave didn't just overtop the massive concrete seawalls, it obliterated them entirely, carrying away structures that weighed thousands of tons as if they were made of foam. The emergency building, designed to withstand any conceivable tsunami, was engulfed up to its roofline, leaving the survivors clinging to radio antennas and air conditioning units. Among those trapped on the rooftop was Miki Endo, a 25-year-old emergency broadcaster who had continued transmitting evacuation warnings even as the water rose around the building. Her final broadcast, captured on multiple recording devices, documented her calm instructions for residents to seek higher ground, even as she herself was running out of options for escape. Miki's story became emblematic of the impossible choices faced by emergency responders during the disaster. Her dedication to warning others potentially saved hundreds of lives in surrounding communities, but her own survival depended on rescue operations that seemed increasingly unlikely as the building disappeared beneath the churning water. The rescue came in a form that nobody could have predicted. A Japan Self-Defense Force helicopter, operating in conditions that violated every safety protocol for aircraft operations, managed to hover just above the submerged building's radio tower. Using a technique that had never been attempted in tsunami conditions, the crew lowered rescue lines to the survivors clinging to the building's highest points. The helicopter rescue operation revealed something remarkable about human behavior under extreme stress. Video footage from the aircraft shows survivors organizing themselves into a systematic evacuation procedure, despite being surrounded by deadly rushing water and debris. The most vulnerable were sent up first, while stronger individuals remained behind to assist with the rescue equipment, demonstrating coordination and selflessness that seemed impossible under such circumstances. But Miki Endo's story took an even more extraordinary turn when she was pulled from the water by the helicopter crew. Having spent nearly 2 hours partially submerged in freezing tsunami water, she had developed severe hypothermia and should have been unconscious. Instead, she continued trying to broadcast emergency information using a handheld radio that had somehow remained functional despite being completely soaked with seawater. The physiological impossibility of Miki's continued consciousness in such conditions baffled medical experts who treated tsunami survivors. Her core body temperature had dropped to levels that typically result in coma or death, Yet she remained alert and focused on her emergency broadcasting duties. Doctors theorized that extreme stress hormones and her singular focus on helping others had somehow overridden normal physiological responses to hypothermia. Her recovery revealed additional details about the tsunami's behavior that challenged scientific understanding of how these waves function. Mickey reported that the water hadn't struck the building as a single massive wave, but as a series of surges that seemed to breathe in and out, alternately rising and falling around the structure. This pulsing pattern created brief opportunities for survival that wouldn't have existed with a conventional tsunami wave formation. The breathing pattern that Mickey described was later confirmed by seismographic analysis of the earthquake's characteristics. The fault rupture had occurred in segments over several minutes, creating a complex wave interference pattern that produced the rhythmic surges rather than a single devastating impact. This discovery led to new understanding about how different types of seismic events generate different tsunami behaviors. In the coastal city of Rikuzentakata, another impossible survival story unfolded that seemed to defy the laws of physics. An elderly man named Takeshi was tending his rooftop garden when the earthquake struck, causing him to lose his footing and fall through a skylight into his house just as the tsunami arrived. Instead of being trapped inside a building that was about to be destroyed, this accident may have saved his life in the most unexpected way. Takeshi found himself in his flooded basement as the tsunami engulfed his neighborhood. The house above him was completely destroyed and swept away, but the basement, being below the main force of the wave, became a pocket of relative calm in the midst of the destruction. As debris settled around the foundation, it created an accidental air pocket that allowed him to survive underwater for nearly 6 hours. The physics of Takeshi's survival shouldn't have been possible according to conventional understanding of how tsunamis interact with structures. The basement should have filled with water and debris, crushing or drowning anyone trapped inside. Instead, the specific way the house collapsed created a protective chamber that maintained breathable air while the tsunami raged overhead. When rescue teams finally located Takeshi 18 hours after the tsunami struck, they found him calmly sitting in his flooded basement, having used floating furniture to create a makeshift raft system that kept him above the water level. He had survived by drinking rainwater that leaked through the debris pile above him and eating emergency food supplies that had floated down from his destroyed kitchen. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Takeshi's story was his mental state during the ordeal. Rather than panicking or becoming despondent, he had used the time to mentally catalogue everything he could remember about his destroyed neighborhood, creating a detailed inventory of which families had lived, in which houses and what landmarks had existed before the tsunami. This psychological coping mechanism helped rescue teams understand the original layout of the community, which had been so thoroughly destroyed that even longtime residents couldn't recognize familiar locations. The systematic destruction captured in Japan created unprecedented opportunities for scientists to study tsunami mechanics in real time. High-speed cameras at research facilities recorded the precise moment when the wave transitioned from a wall of water into a debris-laden flow that behaved more like liquid concrete than normal seawater. The transformation occurred when the wave picked up enough solid material to change its fundamental properties, creating a semi-solid mass that could carry entire buildings intact for miles. This debris-laden flow created survival scenarios that defied conventional wisdom about tsunami safety. In several documented cases, people who were swept away by the wave actually survived longer than those who remained in supposedly safe locations, because the debris provided flotation and protection from the water's crushing force. The key to survival wasn't avoiding the water entirely, but finding ways to ride on top of the debris field rather than being crushed beneath it. One particularly extraordinary account comes from a school bus driver named Yoshiaki, who was evacuating students when the tsunami overtook his vehicle. Instead of being crushed or overturned, the bus was lifted by the wave and carried inland on top of the debris flow, floating like a boat through what had once been residential neighborhoods. The children inside experienced the terrifying journey as the bus navigated between floating houses and overturned cars, finally coming to rest in a rice field several miles from the original road. Yoshiaki's quick thinking during this impossible ride saved all 23 children on the bus. Realizing that the vehicle was floating rather than being destroyed, he used the steering wheel to navigate around the largest pieces of debris, essentially piloting the bus like a ship through the flood. His account describes the surreal experience of driving through living rooms of destroyed houses while maintaining normal bus safety protocols, ensuring the children remained seated and calm despite the extraordinary circumstances. The children's accounts of this journey provide unique insights into how young minds process extreme disaster experiences. Rather than focusing on the destruction around them, many remembered specific details about floating objects they had seen, describing the tsunami as carrying everyone's things from one place to another. Their perspective reframed the disaster not as pure destruction, but as a massive, chaotic relocation of an entire community's possessions. Medical teams treating tsunami survivors discovered that children often showed remarkable psychological resilience compared to adults who had experienced the same events. Child psychologists theorized that young minds were better able to accept the complete transformation of their environment without trying to reconcile it with previous expectations. Adults struggled with the cognitive dissonance of seeing familiar places rendered completely unrecognizable, while children adapted more quickly to the new reality. The Japanese disaster also revealed cultural factors that influenced survival outcomes in ways that transcended physical preparedness measures. Communities with strong social cohesion and established mutual aid traditions showed higher survival rates than areas with similar physical infrastructure but less community organization. Traditional practices like neighborhood watch groups and community disaster drills proved more effective than high-tech warning systems in getting people to safety quickly. One remarkable example of community organization occurred in the fishing village of Fudai, where a controversial seawall construction project from the 1970s became the difference between survival and complete destruction. The mayor, who had insisted on building the wall higher than engineering recommendations, had been criticized for decades as wasteful and paranoid. When the tsunami struck, his oversized wall was the only barrier in the region that successfully protected the community behind it. The Fudai seawall story demonstrates how individual leadership and community decision-making can have consequences that extend far beyond their original context. The mayor's insistence on maximum protection, based on his study of historical tsunami records rather than contemporary engineering standards, saved over 3,000 lives and preserved an entire way of life that was destroyed in neighboring communities. But even the most prepared communities faced challenges that no amount of planning could address. The tsunami's impact on nuclear facilities created a secondary disaster that multiplied the complexity of survival and recovery efforts. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, designed to withstand the largest tsunami in recorded history, was overwhelmed by waves that exceeded every engineering prediction. The nuclear emergency created a new category of survival story that combined natural disaster survival with radiation exposure risks. Plant workers who remained at the facility during the crisis faced impossible decisions about personal safety versus public responsibility. Their accounts describe working in conditions that resembled science fiction scenarios, wearing protective equipment while managing nuclear systems in buildings damaged by earthquake and flood. Among these workers was Masao Yoshida, the plant manager who stayed at his post for days while directing cooling efforts to prevent complete meltdown of the reactor cores. His leadership during the crisis involved making decisions with no precedent in nuclear emergency procedures, essentially improvising solutions to problems that had never been contemplated by safety planners. Yoshida's account of those critical days reveals the psychological pressure of knowing that his decisions could affect millions of people while working with incomplete information about the extent of the damage. The combination of natural disaster stress with nuclear emergency management created a unique form of survival challenge that required both technical expertise and extraordinary personal courage. The evacuation of communities around the nuclear plant created its own remarkable survival narratives. Residents had to abandon their homes not because of immediate tsunami damage, but because of invisible radiation risks that could persist for decades. The psychological challenge of leaving everything behind due to an invisible threat proved more difficult for many people than the physical survival challenges of the tsunami itself. These nuclear evacuees faced the unique trauma of surviving a natural disaster only to discover that their victory over the immediate threat had led to a different form of permanent displacement. Their stories reveal how survival can be a complex, ongoing process rather than a simple matter of escaping immediate danger. The international response to Japan's disaster created collaboration between scientists, emergency responders, and communities that generated new approaches to tsunami preparedness worldwide. The detailed documentation of the event provided researchers with data that led to fundamental advances in understanding wave behavior, structural engineering, and human response patterns during extreme emergencies. Coastal communities around the Pacific began implementing Japanese-inspired preparedness measures, but adapted to local conditions and cultural contexts. The universal lessons about community organization, individual preparedness, and the limitations of technological solutions created a new international standard for tsunami readiness that emphasized human factors as much as engineering solutions. The stories from Japan also highlighted the importance of traditional knowledge in disaster preparedness. Rural communities that maintained historical awareness of previous tsunami events showed better survival outcomes than areas that had relied primarily on modern scientific predictions. Oral histories and cultural practices that preserved information about ancient disasters proved to be valuable supplements to contemporary monitoring technology. These traditional knowledge systems often contained specific practical information that scientific models had overlooked. Stone markers placed by previous generations to indicate safe elevation levels, traditional building techniques that provided structural flexibility during earthquakes, and community practices for rapid evacuation all demonstrated their continued relevance in modern disaster scenarios. The integration of traditional wisdom with contemporary technology created some of the most effective preparedness strategies that emerged from studying the Japanese disaster. Communities that combined historical knowledge with modern warning systems achieved evacuation rates that exceeded either approach used independently. As research continues into the Japanese tsunami's lessons, new details emerge that further illuminate the complex relationships between natural forces, human preparedness, and survival outcomes. The disaster serves as a comprehensive case study in how modern societies can both succeed and fail when confronted with extreme natural events. The psychological long-term effects on survivors created their own ongoing stories of adaptation and recovery. Many people who successfully evacuated and avoided physical harm experienced survivor guilt and anxiety that persisted for years after the immediate danger had passed. Support networks that developed among survivor communities became crucial resources for processing experiences that were difficult for outsiders to understand. These survivor networks often became advocacy groups that promoted improved preparedness measures and supported research into tsunami behavior and community resilience. Their first-hand knowledge of what worked and what failed during the disaster provided invaluable insights for improving future emergency response capabilities. The continuing evolution of survival stories from the Japanese disaster demonstrates how our understanding of these events develops over time. Initial accounts focused on immediate survival and rescue operations, but longer-term follow-up revealed additional layers of complexity in how individuals and communities adapt to surviving such overwhelming natural forces. The stories emerging from Japan's disaster continue to reveal new dimensions of human resilience and the ocean's incomprehensible power. In the years following the tsunami, researchers discovered that some of the most remarkable survival accounts had been overlooked in the initial chaos of rescue operations. These delayed testimonies paint an even more complex picture of how people endure when nature exceeds every boundary of human preparation. One such account comes from Hiroshi, a marine biologist who was conducting underwater research when the earthquake struck. His submersible vehicle was approximately 200 feet below the surface when the seismic waves began, creating a unique perspective on how tsunamis form from beneath the ocean itself. What he witnessed challenged fundamental assumptions about wave generation and provided insights that traditional surface observations could never capture. According to Hiroshi's detailed log entries, the underwater environment became chaotic long before any surface disturbance was visible. Schools of deep-sea fish that typically remained in specific depth zones began swimming frantically toward the surface, while bottom-dwelling creatures abandoned their usual habitats and moved in coordinated patterns that suggested they were responding to signals humans couldn't detect. The ocean floor itself seemed to be breathing, with sediment clouds rising and falling in rhythmic patterns that preceded the actual tsunami formation. Most remarkably, Hiroshi's instruments recorded pressure changes that indicated the water column was reorganizing itself into the massive wave structure that would eventually reach the coastline. From his underwater vantage point, he could observe the tsunami's birth as a vertical displacement of the entire water mass, rather than the horizontal wave motion that people experience on the surface. This perspective revealed that tsunamis are fundamentally different from ordinary waves, behaving more like liquid mountains being pushed across the ocean floor. When the wave finally formed above him, Hiroshi found himself in the strange position of being safer underwater than anyone on the surface. The submersible was carried along by the deep current systems that feed tsunami waves, essentially riding beneath the destruction while remaining protected from the chaotic surface conditions. His journey lasted nearly 8 hours, during which he was transported over 50 miles from his original research location. The underwater ride provided unprecedented documentation of how tsunamis interact with seafloor topography and marine ecosystems. Hiroshi's cameras captured massive underwater landslides triggered by the earthquake, showing how the ocean floor itself became part of the destructive force. Entire underwater canyons were reshaped in minutes, with millions of tons of sediment being redistributed across the continental shelf. Perhaps most disturbing were his observations of the tsunami's impact on marine life. Deep-sea creatures that had never encountered surface conditions were swept up into the waves' massive circulation patterns, creating an underwater mixing of ecosystems that would have long-term consequences for marine biology in the region. Hiroshi documented species interactions that had never been observed, as creatures from different depth zones were forced together in the tsunami's chaotic underwater environment. His eventual rescue came through a coordination between Japanese maritime authorities and international deep-sea research vessels that had been monitoring the disaster from offshore. The submersible's emergency beacon had continued transmitting throughout his underwater journey, allowing rescue teams to track his movement and predict where he might surface when his life support systems finally required him to ascend. These extraordinary accounts of survival against impossible odds remind us that the ocean's power operates beyond human comprehension. Yet human resilience and ingenuity can triumph even in the face of nature's most devastating forces. From the depths of underwater chaos to the heights of emergency broadcast towers, these stories reveal both our vulnerability and our remarkable capacity to endure, adapt, and ultimately survive the unthinkable.